What's up, friend? I want to talk to you about the do's and don'ts of applying powder because there's a lot of misguided information on the internet and I don't want you to fall into the trap. Don't use pressed powder foundations unless you're super oily. And even then, I'd use it a little sparingly because your oils can actually come through the foundation, which can cause oxidation, which then makes your foundation look cakey. And this is a common thing that happens with MAC Studio Fix powder. And I'm seeing a lot of brands come out with powder foundations. And I just want you to be wary of this because most powder foundations are matte and full coverage. So if you're dry or have more mature skin and you don't want to look dry, this is not the foundation for you. Powder foundations is only going to make your skin look drier because it's a powder. Do try a pressed powder that is a satin finish and is lightweight if you're looking for something quick and on the go. The satin powders tend to look a little bit nicer on the skin because of that finish, but just be careful because it's still a powder, and powders in general, especially ones that are a foundation powder, they have a lot of pigment, and by nature, it's gonna end up looking dry throughout the day. And it can settle inside lines that we don't want it to settle into. Don't use any sponge that comes with any pressed powder, whether it's a blot powder or a powder foundation, because what happens is the more that you use that sponge for touch-ups or even to apply, over time any oils or moisturizer on your face settles into that sponge. So then when you go to reapply and pick up new powder, what happens is that oils or any skincare or anything that's on that sponge transfers to your powder and leaves these hard spots. Have you ever noticed that? It's these hard spots, and then when you go to apply it again and pick up from that hard spot, nothing's gonna show up on your sponge. So just throw those sponges away. It's just filled with bacteria. They're no good. Instead, I want you to get a kabuki brush or a small brush, so do get a small brush to carry around with you for your pressed powder. I carry this powder with me every day and this brush. This is my touch-up one. It is translucent. I only use it if I have a little bit of shine and I just need to touch up if I'm running around. Please don't bake. No baking ever. This is probably the biggest pet peeve I have about the internet, and I know every other professional makeup artist agrees with me. Baking is wrong for so many reasons. And the number one reason is it's too much powder. So like I've mentioned earlier, it's gonna make your skin look dry. Plus, using that much powder is going to make your foundation look cakey, just like I was talking about earlier with the pressed foundations. You're putting all of this loose powder on your face and you're letting it sit there, and it's just going to over time soak in, but then when you brush it away, you're not really brushing a lot away. You're just having this glob of powder on your face. Think of baby powder. When you wet baby powder, it gets clumpy. So if you're putting that on your face over liquid foundation and you tend to get a little bit oily throughout the day, what's gonna happen to your face? We don't want that. So baking is the thing that I loathe the most on the internet. And it really bothers me when brands come out with powders that are called baking powders, because why are you encouraging this? This is not something that anybody should be doing. It makes your skin look dry, it makes it look cakey, and it's just no, you're wasting way too much product. Now that that rant is over, I'm gonna show you the proper way to use powder if you don't want it to look like you have powder on and you want a very fresh face, natural finish. Even if you use a full coverage, you can see I have a full coverage foundation on right now. That doesn't mean I have to pack on the powder. We're gonna do a thin layer. I'm going to use a powder brush to apply the powder. Now, a lot of times when people do baking, they use a powder puff. I don't want you to use a powder puff because powder puffs pick up a lot of product. And like I mentioned earlier, they can trap bacteria, just like the sponge that's in your compact powder. So brushes are going to be your friend. Plus brushes, especially ones like this, they're very fluffy. So the fluffier the brush, it's the less product it's going to pick up and the less product that it's going to disperse on your face. The powder I'm using is the Anastasia translucent powder. If you're setting your makeup, I do want you to use a translucent powder, especially if you want something more natural. Now, if you're like, Donna, I want a lot of coverage, you can use a powder that has pigment on top of it, but just so you know, the more pigment that a powder has, the heavier it's gonna be. So if you tend to be more oily, just know that if you have something heavier on your face, the more oils that are gonna try and come out. Before you apply your powder, you're gonna make sure that your concealer isn't creasing in any spots, because if your concealer is creasing, guess what? You're gonna set that crease with your powder. All right, now I am going to dip my brush right into the container, and that's a lot of powder. So I'm gonna tap it off back into the container, and I'm actually gonna tap even more on top of the lid. The reason I'm tapping it onto the lid is because that's how much powder I wanna use for my face. There's still powder residue on my brush, So I'm going to go in and apply it. Now, when you're putting your brush down, you're gonna hear me talk about this a lot, purposeful placement. I want you to first put the powder where you will get oily throughout the day. So for me, I tend to get really oily in my T-zone from my hair. So when I'm applying the powder, the first place that I like to go to is my forehead. And I just press right in the center, because this is the area that I do get the oiliest. And then I just dab around the rest of the spots, well, the rest of my forehead. And I'm dabbing instead of going back and forth, because if you go back and forth, you can end up moving the foundation. So doing this light bit of pressing, you actually create a barrier that protects the foundation from moving. So now that I've applied that, I can go all over back and forth like this, and it won't disturb any of my makeup. Same thing when I'm doing my cheek, I like to press. And this is a really good tip for those of you who might have textured or very large pores. If you do this pressing, it's going to really set your makeup without disturbing it. And especially if you have any acne or you're covering up a lot of area, if you go back and forth immediately, again, it's gonna move the foundation. So just press and be really purposeful with your placement. When it comes to setting around the eye and the concealer, I will put a little bit of extra powder onto my brush, and I'll put that on my eyelid. But then when I'm going underneath the eye to set my concealer, I don't get any more powder on my brush because I don't want it to look cakey. Instead, I use the residue of what's on my powder brush, squeeze it, and just press right on top of the concealer. This is not a lot of product, so I don't have to worry about it creasing throughout the day. I want you to notice how little powder I'm using. You don't see any residue on my face, and you don't see any powder puffing up around me. That just shows you it's a little bit. A little bit goes a long way. And this tub, even though it's $36, it will last you months. It's one of my favorite translucent powders, so if you are looking for a new one, I do highly recommend you give it a whirl. This isn't a do or a don't, it's just something that you need to know. HD powder is a finishing powder. HD powder was created to blur imperfections on camera. And blurring imperfections mean that it just smooths out the texture of the skin so you don't see any pores or blemishes or things like that. Now, this can also apply to your selfies or any photos you take on your phone, but just know that you still want to use HD powder very sparingly, otherwise you can have an Angelina moment, and I don't want that to happen to you. Same thing will happen if you bake. So again, just avoid the baking too.